Hi, folks. I wanted to say a few words about the Vietnam War, particularly kind of the strange, illogical nature that characterized the American war effort. This was a struggle in which the United States entered gradually, pretty much uh, based upon the will of presidents. There was never a declaration of war, and escalation occurred. Um, well, first, President Eisenhower sent advisors, a few hundred people back in the late 1950s. John F. Kennedy, by the time of his assassination, had like maybe 16,000 Americans of different categories um, uh, in South Vietnam. Um, but it's really Lyndon Johnson who's the person who explodes America's involvement in the war. And if you talk to Vietnam War veterans, um, you'll hear all sorts of stories of the kind of irrational, nonsensical things that they witnessed happening during the war, which it's been pointed out by many authors and scholars that Johnson never had really a plan to win the war exactly. That he would meet with the Joint Chiefs, the heads of the military branches, and they would in effect tell the president what sort of commitment he needed to make to avoid losing the war in the next 3 months or whatever. And so Johnson is like a poker player who gradually puts more and more chips into the pot until, in effect, he's bet his entire presidency on a war that really he had little personal commitment to. Johnson cared more about domestic policies, but he felt hostage to the Vietnam War, that if he wasn't successful in Vietnam, that his Republican adversaries would eat him alive, and that he would go down to political defeat, and his plans for his Great Society domestic agenda would be destroyed. And so um, um, I remember stories. My father-in-law served 2 tours in Vietnam, and he had a kind of a large number of anecdotes about things that he remembered. Um, the fact he was a helicopter pilot with in the air cavalry, and he participated in flying troops into landing zones, and then flying out and picking up casualties, bringing in reinforcements, and then withdrawing those units when the fighting was over, which of course was for him dangerous. He's getting shot at the whole time. But my father-in-law talked about how he remembered American troops fighting, successfully taking a given hill or a given piece of terrain, and then routinely withdrawing. And within weeks or months, the enemy was right back where they had been before. Why would you do that? but this was the nature of the Vietnam War. There were no front lines, and this happens again and again over the years. My father-in-law liked to tell the story about how in about 1967 he was ordered by his unit commanders to embark on a humanitarian mission. The Mekong River in the southern part of South Vietnam had flooded, and villages were basically underwater, and the people were in need of assistance and food. And so my father-in-law and other, pilots of his squadron, they took off in their helicopters, and they flew southward toward the Mekong Delta, which at the time was basically under Viet Cong control. So this was hostile territory. They arrived at the right coordinates. There below them were these villages, half underwater, and many people, I guess, were sheltering in trees or up on roofs or things like that. But given the fact that there was a heavy enemy presence, the American choppers did not descend. They didn't land because they were getting shot at. And so my father-in-law hovered at like between 1,000 and 2,000 feet, way, way above the ground, above the deck. And his crew chief, his sergeant, went into the rear of the helicopter, and he and the gunners kicked out 100-pound sacks of rice. Um, and they watched those bags of rice tumble through the air. They landed on the roofs of this village. And of course, the weight caused them to go through the roofs, which were made of thatch, down into the floodwaters, where the rice was then contaminated and no one could eat it. And then once this delivery was complete, the American helicopters, the Hueys, turned around and they flew back to base. They landed. And my father-in-law said about a week later, a brigadier general and other high-ranking officers showed up. They lined them up on the tarmac in front of their helicopters. The press was there to take pictures. And they pinned medals on their chests for this great humanitarian effort that all the pilots and crews knew had actually not helped anybody. They didn't deliver anything that was useful. They got shot at, and my father-in-law talked about how routinely people would take off their flak jackets when they were in the air and sit on them because you have high caliber rounds coming through the body of the helicopter from below. The other thing is that in front you have a plexiglass bubble that won't stop any kind of enemy fire. And so in many cases, you're flying in to a landing zone, getting peppered with rounds. I believe my father-in-law was shot down twice and had to be rescued. And so he's down in the jungle with a .45 caliber pistol waiting for his buddies to come and pluck him out before he's captured. The other thing about my father-in-law's experience was that I think in his second tour, the man in the other seat next to him, his co-pilot, was shot and killed. A round came through the front plexiglass and killed him instantly. And my father-in-law, not surprisingly, for the rest of his life, dealt with post-traumatic stress. He didn't like loud noises and didn't like the 4th of July very much. And so those kinds of stories are really commonplace about the war in Vietnam. The United States, the superpower, had all these fancy weapons, but could not break the resistance of guerrillas armed with AK-47s. You can drop a lot of bombs, but if there's no real targets down below to hit, it doesn't really help you out very much. You're just destroying, water buffaloes and rice paddies and, jungle. So the Vietnam War drags on for 15 years, and eventually the United States people grow tired of it. The anti-war protests grew. It became clear that a majority of Americans wanted us out of Vietnam, and that support for the war after 1968 really dwindled. And it was just a matter of kind of finishing the war off with some measure of dignity for the United States. In the end, the Americans left, and the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong waited about a year, and they occupied South Vietnam. It wasn't like the United States was defeated militarily. If you think about casualties, the United States inflicted many more casualties than we took in that war. It was simply that the North Vietnamese leadership was willing to accept the losses. They had been fighting the French for decades before the Americans ever arrived there. And the American people weren't willing to see their husbands, sons, and other family members die in a war that no one really understood why we were there. So that's a war also that is still highly contentious today. All you need to do is get people of the baby boomer generation, the people who were alive in that period, and start talking about Vietnam, and you can get people red hot angry very quickly. It's like the division in the United States is buried in their brains from that era. And all you have to do is stir it up and it'll come right out again. So I hope you've had a great week. The 1960s is just a remarkable period in American history. So there's, myriad good topics that we could talk about. Have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you later.